Welcome to the opening keynote address for IASSIST, the 48th conference here in Philadelphia. So let's do a little bit of housekeeping, and then we're going to break into our fireside chat with our three esteemed guests. So we've got some housekeeping details to get started. This is going to be the main room where we do a lot of the bigger sessions, like the keynote tomorrow. After our fireside chat this morning, we actually, instead of having presentation sessions, we're having conversation sessions. So please, please, please look for either the regional conversation for your area or the interest group conversation that you would like to join. If you decide not to, I will be scouring the hallways, shooing you into discussions. Because if one thing that I've learned over the past 20 plus years in IASSIST is that the conversations are almost worth more than the presentations. Sorry, presenters. So we'll get that started. Lunch and all of our meals will be in the Hamilton room, so where you had breakfast. I know it's a long trudge all the way across the lobby, but you got to get your steps in somehow, otherwise your Fitbits would just die of unuse. So then this afternoon we start the formal presentations. All of the rooms should be marked, and the presentation should be marked outside the rooms. It's all in this area. And then we have posters this afternoon, correct? So do not miss the poster sessions. They are absolutely fantastic. So that's sort of the run of show for today. I do have another note for tomorrow night for the banquet. We are following an old IASSIST tradition, and we're trapping you on a boat. And for those who have been around for a long time, we hope the boat will actually leave the dock, because that isn't always a guarantee. But please plan to arrive at the dock no later than 6 p.m. You will have access to the boat starting at 5:30. The bar is open at 5:30. So feel free to get there early. Please, please, please make sure you're there by 6 so that we can depart on time. We'll assume we're departing. So the rules of the road for this particular presentation. I want to make sure that everybody understands that this is a discussion. We're not going to have fancy slides, but we are going to have lots of substantive conversation. The rules of the road we're going to have here is we're going to start out with conversations about what we know, go to what we don't know, and then talk about what we can do about it. We're going to wait and ask to take questions at the end unless it's a clarification. So if there's something that just didn't make sense, you need to ask a clarifying question, please raise your hand. Kevin's going to be our mic runner. And so please, please, please make sure that you use the microphone so that the people who are on Zoom can hear your question. People on Zoom, your questions are also welcome. So please type into the chat and I will figure out who's watching that. And I think that is it. So do we have any questions before we get started? Excellent. In that case, I'm going to sit down and start the chat part. Hello, it's me. Okay, so this is a session that we put together to have what looks like a conversation with three people who have spent a great deal of time thinking about diversity and data issues. And as soon as I clip this on, I will introduce them. I even printed this out in really, really big type so I don't need my glasses. Don't get old. It's terrible. Okay, so I'm going in alphabetical order just because that makes life easier. So I'm going to start with Professor Jackie Carter. Jackie is a professor of statistical literacy at the University of Manchester in the UK and the academic lead for EDI disability. She has received UK awards as a 1 in 20 Women in Data and a National Teaching Fellow. She writes and speaks internationally about the Data Fellows program she has pioneered, which creates opportunities for undergraduates and which has had success in including those from disadvantaged backgrounds and underrepresented groups to gain paid work placements in data and tech industries. Her current role as the Disability Academic Lead for the University of Manchester is opening up opportunities to ask questions about how inclusive higher education actually is and whether we have access to the data we need to make informed decisions for our staff and students. Jackie has spent her life in educational roles, first as a school teacher, then in professional services and academia, and only becoming an academic in her later career. Data has always been an integral part of those roles. Her current research is exploring career transitions between sectors with her book, Feminist Changemakers in the Academy, From Practitioner to Professor, From Academic to Activist, due to be published in 2024. So please welcome Jackie. Directly to my left is Dr. Kirsten Thorpe. I said that right? Excellent. Kirsten is a descendant of the Worimi people, almost, from Port Stephens in New South Wales, and is a Chancellor's Postdoctoral Indigenous Research Fellow at Jumbunna Institute for Indigenous Education and Research at the University of Technology, Sydney, Australia. Kirsten leads the Indigenous Archives and Data Stewardship Hub, which advocates for Indigenous rights in archives and data, including the right of reply to records, and develops research and engagement in relation to refiguring libraries and archives to support the culturally appropriate ownership, management, and ongoing preservation of Indigenous knowledges. Her aim is to empower Indigenous people to exercise rights of ownership and control over data to inform self-determined priorities and goals. Prior to her move to academia, Kirsten gained extensive experience working in major collecting institutions across public libraries and archives to support Indigenous engagement and priorities. She was the manager, Indigenous Services, at the State Library of New South Wales, where she led the development of strategies supporting statewide information services for Indigenous people. During this period, Kirsten also contributed to national and international dialogue on Indigenous archival practices, publishing extensively in academic journals and scholarly literature. So please give Kirsten a warm welcome. And last in the alphabet, but certainly not least, is Kathleen Weldon. Kathleen is the Director of Data Operations and Communications at the Roper Center for Public Opinion Research at Cornell University in New York. Kathleen manages data provider relations, oversees the data curation process, plans archival development, and works closely with the IT development team in building new user tools. Kathleen is committed to promoting the informed use of historical public opinion data and builds tools to assist researchers in finding and understanding these data. As a part of the Roper Center's efforts to support the understanding of Black American public opinion and increase diversity in the field of survey research, she has developed multiple user guides to researching racial issues in US polling. Please give a warm welcome to Kathleen. I promised you a fireside chat. A fireside chat you shall have. So I wanted to start with the question about what we know, right? So thinking about the three areas that you specialize in, what do data look like in your area? What are the challenges? What are some of the common points? And I have randomly selected a participant to go first, and so since Kathleen got introduced last, she gets to go first.
Oh, I wasn't warned about that. As Sam mentioned, I focused heavily on Black American public opinion polling. Our collection, the archive where I work, goes back to the 1930s. And so you can imagine, you see a lot of methodological changes and a lot of attitudinal changes about measuring and understanding race. So one of the issues that comes up is that people have not really, researchers have not prioritized learning about Black American public opinion, asking questions of large enough Black American samples to do any sort of meaningful analysis. There are also some major problems in the early data that come about because of the way they categorized race. I know this is going to be a shock to you. For a very long time, it was white and not white. That was it. Sort of the problems that the census had get magnified by the fact that you're doing a small sample of the population. So fewer people, bigger problems. The early days of polling were quota samples, and it's particularly problematic because the Gallup poll makes up the lion's share of early American public opinion polling, really until the 70s. Gallup ran the roost. And George Gallup was interested in the opinions of what he called the engaged public, which might really mean, on some level, the privileged public. He was interested in people who had political and economic power. And so he asked questions using the electoral results as a guideline in his sampling. So places that had high turnout were sampled more extensively, and you can imagine Black people in the South, where they had been systematically disenfranchised, were simply not included in many, if not nearly all, of his polls. So there's a huge gap there that just can't be filled. Some of the other organizations did try to represent the national public, but they gave a lot of power to their interviewers. They were allowed to go out and pick people as long as they filled their quotas. Now, they did have some racial quotas, white, not white, but beyond that, there wasn't a lot of attempt to reach deeply into communities where the interviewers, who were all white, let's be clear, were comfortable. They were allowed to pick people that they felt comfortable approaching. Things changed with the advent of telephone polling, which was great in some respects and not so great in others. The way that it improved things is that interviewers no longer identified what race the respondent was. They actually had to ask them. They were on the phone, you have to ask. Before that, they simply chose to categorize people based on what they saw. And so that was an improvement. However, sample sizes decreased because telephone polling was more expensive than doing vast quota samples, probability polling. So it brought the sizes down, which meant that the samples went down. And they got to the point where the samples were small enough that the average poll would not include enough Black respondents to be able to analyze that population, and certainly not to do any subpopulation analysis. So that's sort of the early historical sweep. Things have improved somewhat. Some good quality organizations that still do relatively small samples will oversample Black and Hispanic Latino communities to try to be at least able to do some analysis, but it's generally race between white, Black, rather than, say, within the Black population. Is there a variety of opinion, which there certainly is, but the ability to get there is really difficult using most of the major media polls, most of the major nonprofits. There are some projects that are focused on Black American public opinion, but they are very small and don't frequently survey. So there's still a big gap there. And new methods are offering some serious potential because new methods are cheaper. Online polling is cheaper. You can get very big samples, and things are changing in that respect. I can point you to tons of data sources that will have enough people to analyze by not just, I'm focusing on Black American public opinion because it's where I've focused my work, but also other subpopulations. But the problem with those methods is that they're very new and young and not proven yet, and the problems that you see with their data and the accuracy become increased the narrower the group that you're looking at. So when you're just getting to the point where you're getting something that looks really promising, the problems are bigger with that promising piece with those smaller populations. So that is where in the biggest terms, that's where things stand with sort of polling history, current polling, and the issue of race.
Thank you, Kathleen. Kirsten, any themes for Indigenous data, or you have a whole slew of issues that are completely different?
I mean, for me, I'm just going to check my microphone's working. That's a good start. I want to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on. In any conversation about diversity, for me, it is making sure that I position myself and acknowledge traditional owners. I want to thank the organisers for being here, but also acknowledge the work that you did to put the land acknowledgement on the website. I think it was such a fantastic introduction so that, you know, for me as a visitor here, could feel that I was placed. And I thought I would just, before I talk about Indigenous data context in Australia, just talk about really quickly what welcome or acknowledgement of country is in Australia. And I guess in the context of talking about diversity, acknowledgement of country and welcome to country was used traditionally as a way for people to express intent of visiting a neighbouring community or nation. And so for me being here as well and acknowledging country, I want to share my intents of being here to share, I guess, a little bit about what's happening in an Indigenous context in Australia, but also express that deep gratitude and recognition. And I also want to extend that respect to other Indigenous or First Nations people who are here today. So for me in Australia, I mean, it's interesting even thinking about the discussion of issues. I do a lot of work around trying to shift paradigms, and so while I recognise, you know, the healing and the work that needs to happen in Australia in the context of colonisation, I try and reframe everything into thinking about Indigenous excellence in that space, and while recognising there are challenges, do everything to shift the paradigm from a deficit approach into one that is actually strengths-based in relation to community. So I guess in that context, even thinking about data and being here with you all, I very much align my thinking with the Australian Indigenous Data Sovereignty Movement, the Mayamnari Wingara definition of Indigenous data is expansive. It's material that is about or relates to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, or material that impacts them. And obviously that aligns with, you know, documents like UNDRIP and the CARE principles of Indigenous data governance. So for me, in terms of thinking about Indigenous data spaces, my team and I at Jumbunna Research are really looking at the intersection between Indigenous research methodologies and how that interplays with data spaces. And I guess what I bring and what I've learned from being trained as an archivist, someone who's worked as an Aboriginal woman in many information spaces, is that some of these things, these questions aren't new, they're just in a different format. So I'm interested in questions of translation. How do we think about this work, not necessarily in the silos that we might operate in, and recognising that there's, you know, really significant work that's happening on the ground to bridge that gap between, you know, our colonial histories of, you know, material being collected about, rather than, not from, not created by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, but about them. So I guess in terms of me thinking about, you know, the paradigm and engaging with Indigenous data, my focus is really on those methods. How do we get together? How do we start to, firstly, recognise the harms of the systems that have embedded colonisation and those approaches everywhere you look, they're being replicated. How do we address those, call them out, but also start to think really seriously about how Indigenous ways of knowing can be embedded in our work. And so I guess in the spirit and in our conversation, it's so nice to see the fire here. So much of what we're thinking about in this work is about well-being. You know, how do we manage risks in a way that don't harm people? So in a lot of my research, I look at how access to data and information that isn't informed by appropriate protocols and community protocols. And by that I also mean us thinking about, well, what is the spiritual and emotional care of data? What are the ceremonies, what are the practices that we need to embed in our work? If we identify and make sure that we're not harming people and making people feel sick in many cases for inappropriate access, then what's our other approach? How can we actually care for people's well-being in a really holistic way? And looking at the fire and thinking about Australia, the concept of country is everything for us. So people talk about being on country, and country is about ancestors, it's about stories, it's about data in the land, you know, it's caring for our plants and ecology. So I guess for me, that's some of the things that we're thinking about in Australia is people talk about the questions of decolonisation and then indigenisation, and I think that they're two very separate but parallel streams, and you need to go softly with both. So yeah, that's me for what I know.
Excellent. All right, Jackie, tell us about your experience with the data that you have been championing, struggling with, however you would phrase it.
Yeah, sure, thank you. Can everybody hear me? It's really important I know that you hear me. So first of all, my background is I am wearing this lovely lanyard, which is green with sunflowers on. And in the UK, that represents that I have invisible disabilities. So many of you I spoke to last night, you would have thought I was absolutely fine, I wasn't wearing this last night, but I actually, as a result of both having had cancer, which automatically means that you're classed as disabled in the UK, and then having a neurological condition in lockdown, I've been left partially deaf and very dizzy, and a bit ditzy. So I'm not the person I was before. In fact, I'm certainly not the person that I was when I was at IASSIST last time. But what that has given me is lived experience of being disabled. And so, in terms of disabilities, the first thing I want to say is that disabilities falls under the Equalities Act 2010 in the UK. So it's a protected characteristic. Yeah, okay, thank you. So thank you for checking that. One of the things I was saying is that disabilities are covered under the UK 2010 Equality Act, which means that we have to be respectful of the rights of disabled people. We also know that disability data are collected in the census and other surveys, and as a result of that, we know that around 20% of the UK population is disabled, has a disability, according to the measures and the questions that are asked. However, and I'm going to talk institutionally, I'm as the academic lead for EDI disability at my own university, which is the University of Manchester, one of the largest UK universities. We know that disability in our sector and in my institution is underreported. So at best, we probably have 11% of staff reporting that they have a disability. So one of the issues and themes I think we've all talked about is missing data. How can you make evidence-informed, data-informed decisions if you don't have the data representing the population that might need additional support or certainly consideration in the lived experience? So I'll keep it short for now because there's many things I want to unpack, but one of the things I want to add to what we've already said is the power of qualitative data, the power of story, where you talked about storytelling. And one of the things I've started to do since stepping into this role is initiate conversations, I'm calling them in-conversation pieces, with people in positions of influence and power at our university, the privileged minority, who may not understand what it's like to be in, a research-intensive university, a world-class university, but to be in that space and live with a disability. So I've initiated these conversation pieces, we're going to be recording them, and we're going to start the conversation where a disabled person, and when I say disabled, I use that term advisedly, I talk about disabled by society, you know, I have disabilities, but I'm disabled by society, where a member of staff, an academic and professional services member of staff may have a disability, but they get to talk to somebody in a position of power and influence at the university about what their everyday lived experience is in that employer space of having that disability. And the reason I'm doing that is because I think, as you said, we need to work at different levels. We need to work with the people who have responsibility for processes and procedures and strategies and so on, but we need to influence up as well as sort of doing a lot of work at the grassroots level. So I'll come back to that later, but that's, I hope, my contribution.
Excellent, excellent. Well, it sounds like we've already started to lead into the next general topic, which I'm sure we'll have much discussion about, but it's the what don't we know, right? So we've already talked about that data are missing. So there's things that are missing. There are potentially things that are misguided. Are there things that, a mind shift that we might need to think about? Do we have any idea about where change might be headed, or do you have suggestions for what other people need to know in order to improve the data space in your area? And we're going to start with Kirsten this time. Thank you.
Yeah, I guess in that context of thinking about colonization, what we see so much in Australia is both a history of distrust of people engaging in any practices of data collection, and also, you know, a real drive from community to be engaged in research design, looking at what are the appropriate methods, what are the questions that people want to have asked, and how will people take care of that information into the future. So if I maybe just talk to those things too separately, I think that you know, what has been missing is that, you know, real commitment to working in partnership research with communities. So for me, working at an Indigenous-led institute and university, what we focus on all the time is what are the questions that communities want to have asked. And so before we even go in, we talk about what first is Indigenous-led research and what is community-based research. And I think always being able to check, you know, your position of power and your position, you know, after all, you know, the question of, well, why do we do research is kind of integral to challenging those histories of distrust. So I think there's a lot of work that needs to happen there. It's really inspiring in Australia to see that work happening. We have wider government policies that are looking at a theme of closing the gap, so looking at socioeconomic determinants of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people over the country. And although I think historically there were a lot of, that distrust had continued with that approach, there's been a lot of advancements in terms of health researchers coming in and saying, well, we need to be a part of the measurement. And that's really where the Indigenous data sovereignty movement in Australia has had a really strong push, but for me and with my interests, it has very much been in quantitative spaces, and so I'm really interested in, well, how do we manage qualitative data in a way that actually gives respect to the nuance and, you know, thinking about cultural protocols over the long term so that you can both inform policy and also reshape that future. And I think for, you know, many of the communities that I've worked with, things like response burden are really huge in terms of, you know, researchers going in and asking questions and then nothing being done. So, yeah, I think that piece has been missing, but I hope that Indigenous-led sort of focus is coming about now.
So Jackie was nodding, so I'm assuming that means that some of this resonated with you.
Yeah, absolutely. We had a warm-up session for this, and everything you said, I thought you could just sort of insert the word disability in there, and it still has relevance, and so it deeply resonated. In terms of disability, yes, mistrust, or not so much lack of trust in the systems, but lack of trust of what will happen with the data if people share. So we use the term share, not disclose, because disclosure, you know, connotes something negative, whereas if we get colleagues to share their disability data in a way that can influence change, that's one thing, but the challenge of encouraging them to share is something else culturally. It's very difficult to get people who might be afraid, fearful, worried about their career progression in the sector to share that they have a disability. And there are different systems that measure this. So because of the way we report data to the external organisations that we have accountability for in the university sector in the UK, you know, there's data that we need to declare on our staff personnel records, for example, and that gets counted and reported in an aggregate fashion back up to the funders of the sector. But there's also data that are collected in confidence by, for example, our Disability Advisory Support Service. And those two things don't tally up. There's a big disconnect between the two types of data. And the other thing is getting our colleagues to share their data through HR records means that we're constantly needing to reach out and ask them to do something else. You know, so for example, I said that I wasn't originally disabled. So on my staff record, I've been at the University of Manchester for 26 years now in a variety of different roles, not always an academic. But that data doesn't feature on my personnel record because I've never updated it. Okay, and I haven't been asked to update it. So, you know, how culturally do we encourage members of an institution, employees, to share that data, and how do we persuade them that that could be shared and used to good effect? And I think for me that's the biggest challenge. It's not about whether the data exists or doesn't, it's how we gather the data in a trustful way that goes beyond just box ticking exercises and, you know, gets our university to do really well on EDI disability, allied to charterships and the like. So I think it's about the practice, you know, the people behind the data, and what Kirsten was saying about encouraging them to realise that there can, I guess there can be power in data, but to overcome the barrier of helping them share it for the right reasons for them, not the right reasons for the institution, but the right reasons for them. And I think my biggest challenge is to work collectively through leadership, through the type of project that I've talked about, to show what can happen and what can change if we do that. So anybody who knows me knows that I go in with a pilot project, I sort of do something under the radar, I just get on and do it, and then I scale it up when I've got some evidence about the impact and how it works. And that's what happened with the Data Fellows programme back in 2013. I placed 19 students into the sector to do workplace research, data-driven workplace research, and that's scaled up to 330 across 8 years in 65 organisations. 70% of those data fellows have been female, well, 70% on average have been female, and 25% have been from underrepresented groups. So I now have a body of evidence to show that if we can create interventions that result in developing, in my case, diverse talent pipelines, you know, it starts to gather momentum. So I think the biggest challenge for me is to, I've only recently stepped into this role, is to do something small, affect with data, so the evidence that comes back from this qualitative and quantitative is really powerful, and then persuade the funders, the people at higher levels in the institution, that we need to do more of this, okay? And data is a part of that, but it's not all of it.
Excellent. Now, Kathleen was nodding at what Jackie said, so I'm assuming we're getting this resonation wave down the stage.
Oh, dear, yes. So there's, in terms of what we don't know in the field of survey research, we don't know what the best methods are for trying to measure public opinion and actually capture public opinion beyond the national totals, or actually we don't even know that at this point. It's in the whole field is in such a state of flux as we try to adapt to new technologies and new realities. So we don't know what the best way to do it is. That's at the researcher side. I'm coming in at the archival side, at the end of the process, so I have no power over them. As much as I would love to tell them what they should be asking and who they should be asking, I can't do that. I'm coming in at the last step. But we have to make sure that we do not allow the perfect to be the enemy of the good. And we have to be willing to think about our standards in a different way. So we've traditionally had, at least at my institution, and I would say in polling in general, a very narrow conception of what makes good data. And they would say, well, this is not as good. The methods aren't as stringent. So we're not going to prioritize the dissemination of that data, the preservation of that data. However, the data that is good is not representing huge portions of the population. So if those people are not being heard, if their voices are not being heard, is it good data? Is it really good data? Are we really doing the best thing by ensuring that the national data that's really high quality is always being preserved, and the other things that are possibly more experimental are not? And those places, there have to be institutions who are willing to take a risk, a reputational risk, a financial risk, in trying new things that may not work out. And as an archive, we have to take a risk in saying that we're going to put our stamp on these things that are new and bring them in. Similarly, looking back, I don't know what other sorts of data were collected that were not considered good enough to preserve. So I have, digging around in the paper in the archive, my favorite thing to do, recreational digging, I recommend it to everyone. I found reports from Black newspapers that did marketing research of their readership. That is interesting, valuable data. It was not cataloged. It was not considered important enough because it was marketing research. It wasn't public opinion, it was marketing. And it wasn't a proper sample, it was just the readership. If that's something that gets information about a significant Black population that we don't have otherwise, it's important to treat as valuable as those Gallup polls. And that's not something that has happened to this point. And then finally, we don't know, sadly, we don't seem to know how to bring more people into the field, a more diverse group of researchers into the field. I am extremely uncomfortable to be here talking to you about Black American public opinion as a white woman. Sorry, I really am. And I have to do that. Again, I can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. If you were to wait around to find, at this moment in time, an expert in Black American historical public opinion who was a Black American, you would be waiting a long time. There's a handful of them, and the amount of expectation, of pressure, of requests, the number of times that they have to represent again and again and again by being the only people in the room who can represent their population both on an academic level and personally is just, it's just overwhelming. So those of us who feel uncomfortable have to deal with that. We have to step up and we have to accept that sometimes it's going to be a little weird. But we also have to really find ways to bring people into the fold if the fold is worth having anyone in. If it isn't, if we can't bring people in, then it's not worth having the fold, right? It's not worth saying this is our field if we cannot make it represent the full range of people's experience. I mean, we always talk about polling. Those of us who really love polling and public opinion research, we talk about it as the voice of the people, that we're preserving the voice of the people. And we are, but it's gotta be all the people. And at the moment, it really is not, for many, many reasons. And again, I focus on Black American public opinion because it's the only place where I feel comfortable having done the depths of research. But I know, for example, those telephone polls never were available to people who had to use assistive technology when they were answering questions on a phone. And so there are lots of gaps, and those need to be delineated. They need to be found. You need to figure that out. You need to read through all of that documentation and figure out exactly where those gaps might be so that any researcher who's using them will be informed and use them responsibly. And we also have to look for where else might we find data and how do we bring people in so that it gets used and so that in the future we have more preservation of everyone's opinion.
Jackie looks like she wants to add something. Okay. Well, so I'm going to take the chair's prerogative and go off script. See, I have a script. But I do find this point interesting that of the 3 people, I believe Kathleen's the only one that is not a member of the population that they study. And so I'm wondering for Jackie and Kirsten, do you see that as a benefit, or do you feel like there are challenges in keeping focused on the topic rather than the fact that it is something that is personally related to you? I'm thinking about this from the perspective of bringing people into the fold. Should we be looking for more people with disabilities to do this research, or more Indigenous peoples to do these research, or can people here join your club?
Shall I start?
Sure.
I think there has to be pragmatism, and I think what you have described, Kathleen, is a pragmatic solution to an historical problem. And to avoid that altogether means to stand still. So I think one of the things we have to do is to get on and do what we can to affect the change that we need to see. Now, it's an interesting question, Sam, because in order for me to apply for the position I'm now in, this EDI academic lead for EDI disability, one of the requirements on the application was to have lived experience of disability. So, you know, there were probably very few people actually at the senior level, they were looking for a prof as well, who either have lived experience or were willing to declare it so that they could apply for the role. So the job wasn't exactly mine, but I'm sure there was a very small pool of candidates from which they chose. Now, is that a good thing? Probably in my case, yes, because it's a leadership role, so it brings credibility and trust, and a shared understanding with the people that I am working with across the university. You know, we have disabled staff networks, we have a neurodiverse group, we have a PGR group that have come together that I'm working with really closely, and we all get it, right? So there's something about being in a group of people, a network of people who all get it, that gives you collectively the confidence and the clout, the power, collectively, if you like, to be able to affect the change that you want to affect. So, you know, nothing about us without us, I think is a phrase that's used. That's not to say that academic researchers can't research groups that they're not part of. So my husband is a political scientist, and he's currently working, I was speaking to somebody about this last night, he's currently working on Roma as a minoritized population across Eastern Europe because they don't have the same legal constitutional rights as other groups in similar categories. Now he's a white, you know, male of a certain profession, educated male, and his colleague is a Slovenian woman by birth. And they're doing a lot of field work, going into the field to observe. So obviously we have methods where, you know, people who don't belong to the group that they're studying can go in and study that group. Of course, that's what ethnography and other methods are about. For me personally, as you asked, for me personally, I don't think I could do the job that I'm doing with the group that I'm working with, to effect the change that is needed if I didn't have lived experience of that. So I think for me it's really important, and I think that's been recognised by the university. But the only other thing I want to say is the policies and processes and procedures and strategies and so on that are designed to bring about change need to be developed collaboratively. I think it's so important to co-produce the knowledge that is going to affect the change. So there's a big movement. We haven't really talked about advocacy groups, but there's a big movement in the UK where disabled advocates are working with scholars to develop charters and so on to bring about the change that we want to see across the population, and to create visibility of disabilities.
You're jumping ahead to the next question,
Yeah,
but that's okay.
I'll
Kirsten,
stop.
and I'm interested in your perspective on this.
No, I would agree. Depending on the day, sometimes, I mean, I even write a lot about people, you know, recognizing their power and then stepping out of the way. I think there's something to be said for people in leadership roles to divulge their power in ways that give back to communities. And for me, that's actually a handing over of resources, and people don't talk about that much. They talk about goodwill, but sometimes it's actually about, creating the new positions, creating the new pathways. I think for me, even working in an Indigenous Research Institute, we have diverse and multicultural base of researchers that are there that are working across disciplinary fields, but Indigenous studies is their core focus. And what we have in that makeup is both Indigenous leadership in terms of our directors and provost chancellors, etc. But I'd have to say that the thing that brings us all together is that commitment to Indigenous research methods and practices and methodologies. And I guess for me, working with people that aren't from community, it's actually understanding what you know and what you don't know, and being able to be in a situation where you can sit back and listen and actually understand that you might be a professor or an academic researcher, but you don't actually know what's happening in a community context. So I think there's nuance there, and there's a lot of things around power relationships, but I think for the work that I do, and having been involved in practice and now looking at it from a research perspective, I, in a similar way, couldn't have gotten to this stage without having the trust of communities. And we always talk about those ideas of, reciprocal relationships and being in a web of relationships. And some of that is about accountability. And I think if you have lived experiences and you're from the community, even when, talking about acknowledgement of country, normally in Australia people will say, who's your mob, who's your family? And so, you'll explain that, my family line is, this family. And so people are actually checking you out to see, well, I know all your family, so I'm going to make sure that we understand what's going on here. And so there's a big power dynamic and shift around communal decision making that might not operate in other contexts. So I think it's important that we encourage diversity in all its forms, and I think that means, building spaces for, in my case, Indigenous leadership, but also ensuring that people have, so much work in Australia around cultural competency, and making sure that people can actually be effective and communicate in those contexts. So I think we need both as well.
So this is a perfect lead-in to the last question, which is, what can we do? I mean, as data professionals, what are the things that we might be able to do to help with some of the issues that you have highlighted? Are there data-specific activities? Are there research-focused suggestions? Again, whether you are part of the community or not, what is it if someone was really interested in helping with some of these issues? What does that look like? So, Jackie, you are on the list to go first.
Okay, can I give you another anecdote before I answer?
You may do that.
Some of you know this because I've shared it on the Slack channel. So I've already said that I became disabled, okay? And I have, throughout my professional life, travelled. I've been to lots of international conferences. I've travelled alone. I've never had a problem travelling before. And I came to this conference, and I arrived in Philadelphia, and my bags arrived in Chicago, okay? So that's okay, bags get lost all the time, right? And in the past, that would have just been, okay, so what? I'll go out and get some clothes, and, I can do this. I'm a strong, independent woman, I can do this, okay? My family laugh at that, but anyway, because they think I'm very scatty, but this time, because I have lost some confidence in my body, okay, because I'm disabled, and because I was informed by the airline who had outsourced the return of my delivery to this company called Where's My Suitcase? I was told, isn't it great? I was told to stay in the apartment. Great name. I was told to stay in the apartment until my bags arrived. Okay, so long story short, that was a 48-hour stay in my apartment, all right? I couldn't make calls on my phone for some reason. It wasn't allowed. Thankfully, I have an amazing support network. I have great family friends. I've got other support networks. But I had to sort of reach out to actually sort of be able to deal with that, right? So that is a disabled person's you know, educated, white woman, disabled person's experience of traveling alone, her bag going missing. I was reunited with my bag, by the way, and I did get one new outfit. I managed to sneak out for an hour. But it really opened my eyes to the lack of consideration in service delivery. Okay, and it wasn't for the want of me constantly being on top of this and trying to say, oh, and the other thing, the missing piece of information is I have to take medication for my condition. My medication was in my suitcase, you know, so I was 72 hours by the time I got it without my medication, right? That had a real impact on me, okay? And I got tons of resilience, and I write about bouncing back in 24 hours and all the rest of it. So if that floored me, imagine the everyday experience of people who don't have that capital, those capitals that I have. So the reason I'm sharing that with you is because in my role now, everything I do is about inclusivity. But disability is, and I'm going to say this because this is how I perceive it, so this is my opinion, is the poor relation in the whole bank of EDI. Okay, so we talk about gender, we talk about race and ethnicity, and other aspects of EDI. Disability tends to get left behind. So why am I sharing that with you? Because every person in this room could have a conversation with a disabled person they know or meet or me, or, you know, and find out what the true lived experience is of that, and then fold that into your practice and make that a core aspect of what you do in any aspect of your data roles. You know, are the polls, are they accessible to all? Okay, are the resources that you're all producing to do data skills, are they truly accessible? Are we working as a data community in a truly accessible way and not just playing lip service to it? And each and every one of us, I believe, has a responsibility to ensure that everybody, all our community, can access the information and services that we provide and the research that we do in a way that is disability accessible from the start. So I think my ask is to make sure everything you do is disability friendly, and it bakes that in. You know, inclusivity is baked into what we do, not an afterthought.
I do think that one of the things that's interesting about the observations on disability is the fact that of the three groups of people that we're talking about up here, disability is the only group that everyone in this room could find themselves in. I'm assuming nobody here knows how to become a Black American or an Indigenous person overnight. If you do, let's have a conversation. There's a great reality TV show in there. But to your point, this is something that has the potential to touch a lot of people. So yeah, very interesting. Kathleen, what would you say that folks here could do as data professionals?
So obviously it's going to depend on your individual role and where you are in the data process, so in the data life cycle. So it's hard to give a blanket recommendation, but I'm going to give one anyway. Be really stubborn, because there will be a lot of people who will be not interested in this. This is just not their priority, and they do not think it should be your priority. You're going to have to ignore them, and that is sometimes very uncomfortable. You're going to have to do it. You're going to have to find a time to carve out from what you do to prioritize this type of work, whatever that work is for your particular position. My role is defined by my role. I don't do qualitative. We don't accept qualitative data into our archive. I can't make that part of my role. So that's not in the cards. What I can do is make sure that when we develop educational materials, so we're looking at the moment, we're developing some educational materials for high school students, starting at, you know, senior level high school, maybe community college level materials to teach people about survey research and how it works, and the math involved, and the question wording issues, and all of these good things. I can make sure that there's an opportunity to focus the content of those materials around topics that are going to address racial issues. And I can make sure that when we do our outreach, We specifically try to target community colleges that serve populations that are not primarily white. I can do that, right? That fits within the role that I have. So you have to be stubborn, you have to find those places and constantly be thinking about, where could I slide this in? Where could I make this thing be addressed in our day-to-day work? I think it's very important just to think about finding aids, tools, simple classical librarian stuff, right? If you want to find these samples to research them, how are you going to do that? It can be hard. Well, we developed a sample type filter, and this doesn't sound like a particularly exciting, revolutionary thing. Oh, great, now you can filter on sample. But you just saved some grad student, hundreds of hours of work, and that increases the chances that there are going to be people who are publishing about Black public opinion or Latino public opinion, and that is going to increase the chances that there are going to be people who feel represented. Even if the person who did it the researcher was not part of that group at least feels that there is someone paying attention, and maybe we get more people. Maybe we get more college students who are interested in this work. And maybe we can diversify the field as well as diversifying the articles, but the actual people. And I think everything that we think about doing often feels very, very small and very imperfect. You spent all this time on Black public opinion. Well, what about, why don't you do the same thing, but we do it for Latino public opinion? Why haven't you done that? Well, because I only have this much time, and and you feel like you're always apologizing for not doing enough or doing too much. Why are you wasting your time on this when we have these bigger things that we have to cope with? So I think that people have to accept a lot of criticism, just swallow it, and stay stubborn and find your little thing. Find the little places where you can shift the needle just a bit until the needle gets moved sufficiently to actually get representation.
Criticism tastes very good with wine. Just thought I'd throw that out there.
Yes.
Kirsten, what about you?
So for me, I think that diversity isn't just about people, it's about people engaging with different ways of knowing and actually being able to engage in new paradigms and understanding that, one worldview doesn't fit in every other place. And I think that's really exciting. I think that there's lots of opportunities for people to actually get uncomfortable but commit to relearning. And I think that there's skills in that. You've got advocacy work to do, as you said, finding the moments that you can make change. I had a director that used to say to me, Kirsten, when you're bashing your head on the wall, so I always felt that viscerally of, the tension of the space. He used to say to me, just move somewhere else and find another place of agency. So I think, we all work really hard, we've got lack of resources, so being able to work smart, I think, is important. I do a lot of work across the International Council of Archives, then library associations, and one of the things that perplexes me is our lack of collaboration across those kind of GLAM spaces and within the university sector. And I get really excited to be in places like this where I think about how that information is translated in those different domains. So I'd really encourage people to get out and talk to people who are doing that work, but also recognize that there's a lot of incredible work that doesn't fit in these formal spaces in grassroots movements that can actually impact the work that we do. So I think that's really important as well, that we're all in a place of privilege. For me, flying from Australia to be here, I looked at the program and thought there's so much amazing stuff happening, so I wanted to come, but this is a place of research, so we have to check ourselves all the time and make sure that we give back to those places. But my last thought is I'm really interested, for me, in the Indigenous data space around the work of Indigenous librarianship and, to build this new kind of wave of, well, what would the translation work be between a community and our formal institutions, whether it's universities or our archives, libraries and museums, And potentially, you know, as a site of excellence, going back to that new paradigm, you know, how could we all contribute to creating new pathways that pull apart our structures, break them, disrupt them, and rebuild them into something that actually cares for country again. You know, I think, you know, so much we're focused on people, but we're in a climate crisis. You know, we have to look after the land that we're all on. So how do we think about that as well in this work to make sure that we aren't extracting all the time? You know, data to me sometimes just feels like, you know, we have to be careful that we're not just thinking about transactional extractive work, but think about that nourishment.
Excellent. All right. It's time for me to stop talking and for you to start talking. So, it's questions from the audience time. So you have to, let me see if I can see any hands.
Does it include online?
Yeah, I don't know who's monitoring the Zoom. Oh, Sarah's monitoring the Zoom. Yay, thank you, Sarah. Do we have any online questions? Not yet. All right, in the room questions.
With the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City. I think my question is more about the Roper. What do you do when these populations are minorities by definition? And how do you, you know, so that creates, it's because they're small populations to begin with.
Yes.
And so how do you maybe create ways to multiply their voices in these things? Because I think that's really a challenge when you, because they're talking about now with the census data and triangulation, but that's actually, if they create noise into the census to protect the, then you're actually diminishing the voices of the minorities in the census data.
Right. I'm not going to talk about the census and the noise because that is
That
there would be
involves a lot of
fights.
alcohol.
Things would be very dangerous in here, and I do not know enough to say anything coherent about that. What I can say is that there are people who do pooling of data. That is one approach. Pooling of surveys across a year or so, finding the same question and the same demographic definitions and being able to pull them together, harmonization of data. That is dependent on the same sorts of user tools that actually help everybody, right? The better we curate the data, the more it's available for all uses. And that's a great argument too if you're trying to get people to support you in doing it. Because anytime you can say, oh, everybody's going to want this, that helps. But it is possible. The small populations, there is in fact a reason why I'm focused on Black American public opinion and not, say, Asian American public opinion or Native American public opinion. The samples are so small, they are non-existent. You're talking about a handful, maybe, if you're lucky, in any particular survey. So I can do something about Black American public opinion because there's not quite enough to really, but there's enough to, if you work at it, you can get something out of it. You know, Latino, Hispanic public opinion is it's a whole other world of complexity. They don't start measuring it until much later. So you see the very first time you see any sort of national level polling with any recognition of Latino ethnicity is in the 60s, but not regularly until the 80s. But there's always ways around things, surprising ways around things. There's a researcher who's been working with the Texas poll because the Texas poll was the only one. It was very early state level poll, the first state level poll, and it measured your options there were included Anglo and Latino. So there was a reason for that. Joe Belden's full name was Jose Belden, and he was a Mexican-American, and he started that poll. And so there was representation there from the beginning, and so we have polls that actually measure attitudes, but it's at that state level. Again, you have to figure out where to find something and try to work with what you can get. I don't know that I have recommendations for the very, very small populations. I think that's going to take a better statistician than I am, which is virtually any statistician. But I think you're going to have to bring big math to some of that work. And some of it you may just have to, it just may not be there. The data may never have been collected. And that's a loss. It's a thing that we cannot correct. And unfortunately, in this world, in this field, there are things that cannot be corrected. They just can't. We can work at doing better, but retroactively, no. There's some populations we're never going to be able to provide them with that sort of data.
Oh, over here. Oh, is that Alicia? Yes. I can't see very well.
It's very bright up here.
It is very bright.
The fire's
It's because we're on,
Hello.
yeah, it's all the fire. It's the heat off the fire.
Alicia Hovik-Moore, I'm at the University of Minnesota. Thank you all. This was a really great conversation, and I've learned so much listening to you. I have a question, actually, a follow-up from this one. So thinking about, the data was never collected, and for those of us who are working with researchers on the experimental methods, they may have collected that data, but when it comes time to share in a public data repository, that is de-identified, it's scrubbed. Categories of specific racial categories are collapsed, white, non-white. Disabilities are collapsed. Do you have a disability? Yes. No, if we're lucky. All sorts of things are collapsed. That gives richness to the data and the sake of privacy and de-identification. So I'm wondering if you have thoughts about, for those of us who are collecting this data and wanting to share it in a way that is appropriate, but also doesn't prevent that and doesn't lose that information forever, if you have insights or how to do that better.
I can say from an Australian perspective that there's a lot of work. Even looking at the care principles around what is appropriate governance. And so if we look at, the question of distrust or, questions of whether people even wanted to participate, and then looking at, who's had control of the data, who's been looking after it. I think if the right governance structure is there, then people can make decisions based on that idea of mutual benefit, collective benefit. If people are participating in and engaging with the data, being able to go through a more rigorous process about, their intentions, their where they're releasing it, what benefit will that give back to a particular community, then I think you can start to break down some of those barriers and release more information. But trust is such a huge thing. And, I was thinking before, why do I do this work? It's because we need the data to inform. The rates of children being removed, Aboriginal children in Australia is extraordinary. We have huge issues with deaths in custody, and so we need that information, but we need to engage in ways that isn't just the paradigm of open, closed, access or not, but get the nuance right in between.
Can I respond?
Yes.
I didn't hear all of the question, but I sort of gleaned what the question was about. And I wanted to come back to the previous point about there's something about place being really important, okay? And we've talked about grassroots and advocacy, and I'm involved in a lot of voluntary work. I work across the Greater Manchester area, which is a conurbation, and we work with the community to raise the issues, particularly that are important to young women and girls. Okay, so we have a whole basket of issues that we're exploring in a decade-long period. And as a result of that, we're starting to run more events where we invite the community into a room to discuss the issues that are affecting them on a sort of lived experience basis, but also in the presence of power holders, policy holders, politicians, people who can influence change. And one of the things that's come out of that, we call them data, dialogue, deeds, and determination. And one of the very concrete data projects that has come out of that is a group of scholars who have come in, listened to the sorts of issues that are being discussed, gone away and found funding to do a data collection exercise called What Do Women Want? Because it's gender focused. And there's something very powerful about sort of going in and listening, we're all talking about, finding out what the real issues are, in the community, and then working together, so scholars working together with the community to gather the data that will help inform the change that we want to see happen. Now, that's been enabled because we have this organisation. It's called Greater Manchester for Women 2028, and it's a decade-long project, all volunteer-led. But because we've already got a platform, if you like, that we can build on, and we're bringing those community groups together who can see what the value of sharing their wisdom, lived experience, their knowledge with us is, we're starting to build that co-creation that we want to see, that we know will affect change, because we can then go back with the data and hold those politicians and people in positions of power who have their nice fancy strategies, we can hold them to account to say, you said, we did, so what are you going to do with this? So for me, there's something very powerful about working with our communities on the issues that they care about, and supporting the collection of data to help move on the debate. I don't know if that's useful, but that's something that's very valuable to us.
Sarah, you have a question on Zoom? All right, where's the microphone?
Okay, this question is from Anja Perry. She has a question for Jackie. Is there work on facilitating data access for people with disabilities? I feel that our archives are not fit for it.
I'm sorry, I didn't, because my hearing's so bad, I didn't hear all of that. Is there?
She says, is there work on facilitating data access for people with disabilities? She feels that their archives are not fit for it.
Okay, the short answer is I don't know, but it's something that I will go away and investigate. It's a really good question, so thank you, Sarah, for asking that.
Really important.
Other questions in the room? Ron.
Hi, my name is Ron McCall. I'm from Stanford University, and first of all, thank you so much for this panel. It reminds me why and what I've missed for the last few years in terms of what I experienced coming to an IASSIST conference. Very inspirational, but very practical. I feel like this struggle for equity is just an ongoing process, but if you, the three of you, can share with us what gives you hope? What gives you hope for the future in terms of the efforts and the struggles that you constantly try to work through to basically make this a better society?
What a great question. I totally should have thought of that.
All right, who would like to go first? Who has hope? Kathleen, do you have hope?
I have hope. Of course,
Okay.
I have hope. So we have a new project this year. We've had a scholarship, a fellowship program for both undergrads and grads the last few years within Cornell. And they come and they do research in the archive. And a couple years ago, we added an element to that where we have a weekly conversation with somebody in the survey research community. And they've been amazing conversations. People have been really engaged. I've seen the students start with asking the most basic questions. And by the end, they're asking questions that are, the sorts of things I'd expect faculty members to be standing up at the end of an academic conference and pointing and saying, I know about this thing. You explain this. They're really impressive. The students are so impressive. But it frustrated me immensely that the people who were getting this experience were Cornell students, as if they didn't have enough connections and privilege and opportunities provided to them. So we partnered with the association, the American Association for Public Opinion Research, APOR, which is the professional organization in public opinion research. And this year, we will have a W.E.B. Du Bois Fellowship to bring in people from underrepresented groups in polling to do some work on developing educational materials and things to reach out to more people. It's just one now, but I'll tell you, oh my God, those applications. The people who were applying for this fellowship, I wanted to have 7 fellowships. I wish I had 7 fellowships. And if you want to go back to what I don't know how to get enough money. I'm sure that's familiar to everybody, but there's great solutions if you just have the cash. But seeing the work that is happening, the undergraduate research that is happening, there's some incredible people who are interested. They're interested and they want to become part of this world, and that excites me. And I think that the more we provide opportunities for people to see themselves represented in data, particularly in survey data, but in data in general, as part of that world from really early on. Most people don't hit, their early 20s and finally develop an interest in, and some do, God knows. But I really think that there's a value in showing from the very beginning, the first time that people are being exposed to this sort of data, this sort of material in their academic lives, that they see themselves there, that it's not something that you become aware of, this niche thing that happens when you're, as a graduate student. And so that gives me hope that there are these wonderful students out there and they're really interested.
Excellent. Jackie, what gives you hope?
Oh, thank you for that question. Brilliant question. Thank you, Ron. I am so hopeful, okay? I've dealt personally with a lot of adversity in my life, and I know there's also so much that we can do individually if we find that tribe, the right people, get into the right places, and raise your voice. So I've just written a piece actually in which I talk about, be the voice in the room that you want to hear. Because if you speak out, you encourage and give permission for others to speak as well. And I also think, the reason I'm hopeful is because those 330 students I have placed in data fellowships in the last 8 years, they are now out in the world of work. Okay, some of them are academics, not very many, but many of them have gone into data and tech professions, and we're talking about people that have come from social science backgrounds, so not your STEM graduate, but somebody who's learned how to do data analysis, some statistics at university, which is not usual in the UK for social science degrees. But we have given them the support, the confidence, the opportunities, the networks, the door-opening experiences, so that when they graduate, they can become that voice in the room to address the inequalities in the systems, right? And we do a lot of work around, I teach a course on measuring inequalities. We talk about systemic inequalities and how we can address them. So where I have hope is the generation of students that are being supported and trained to do data analysis are now becoming the future leaders, and there's something very powerful when you support somebody who then takes up a position that they probably never thought they could have got prior to having done this data fellowship, and they suddenly take people along with them and they become the sponsors. So this is how you scale up a program. You do a pilot, you scale it up, then you get the organizations who are benefiting from taking those students to take a second. So you pay for one, they pay for the second. That's how we do it. That's how we've gone up to 330. And so I feel the reason I'm hopeful is because I'm changing the world one data fellowship at a time. And because I keep in touch with all those alumni and I tell their stories and they come back and they connect back to the university and support, we're creating this virtuous circle. The world has changed in that decade, and if we can change the world in a decade with one program, think what we can do collectively.
Excellent. Kirsten, what gives you hope?
Well, I was thinking very cheekily that there's an Australian Indigenous academic, Chelsea Wadigo, and she says, "Fuck hope." And she's written a book called Another Day in the Colony. And Chelsea's work really challenges us to think about the sense of hopefulness and what that means. I'm probably not as cynical, but I appreciate her perspective because she's talking about the reality of systemic racism, long-term economic disadvantage, poverty. And so I don't think we can remove ourselves from that reality as well. I always feel like, I've kind of been in this game for over a couple of decades, and all of a sudden I'm seeing this change of people's consciousness being awakened. And I guess, to be here at a conference on diversity is a part of that. I'm hopeful that people will engage in this space with Chelsea's spirit as well, of realizing that, when you come with privilege, you don't know what it's like to have nothing. You don't understand, in an Australian context, what does it mean to have the theft of land and children stolen. And I'm sure that resonates with many, both Indigenous communities, but other marginalised communities. So I think that genuine interest of people understanding what privilege means, how they can exercise themselves through true reflexive practices to understand that and engage in dialogue is something that's really special. And again, I always go back to that idea of, the data just isn't about us. I think we have some major work to do bridging the gap with the work that we do to care and protect land. And I'm hopeful about that. I'm hopeful that we won't see ourselves as being at the top of the food chain, but realize even in terms of fire, I was thinking about fire practices in Australia. There's so much work happening with cultural burning that informs people having a really healthy life. And so I'm hopeful that we'll decenter ourselves in some ways from, this idea that we have to measure everything, but get back to some truly special stuff about looking after all the things that are around us. So I'm not going to just leave with Chelsea's abandonment. If you want to read a great book, Another Day in the Colony, it's very good. But things are changing. And again, with the younger generation, it's so good to see people who don't have to do that. They don't have to navigate their language to be polite all the time when they see racism, when they see things that are actually harmful, I guess that time hopefully has now gone, which is great.
I'm afraid to ask if there's any other questions, because this feels like a great place to end on that hopeful note. But if you have a question that's not a Debbie Downer question. All right, fine.
Oh, great. I'll try not to make it Debbie Downer. Cass Wilkins Saldania. I'm at Brown University Library. I love this discussion. Okay, so I don't think this has to be inherently pessimistic. I would love to hear about what authentic, with collaboration with community, with this data work looks like. And I think a lot of us, we work for institutions that have really difficult histories with our neighborhoods, with our cities. I work for Brown, and there's a lot of interest in getting good community level data. And that interest is driven by a connection to the institution, a connection to research. And that's good. And I feel like if we want to truly be a partner, it requires a lot of humbleness and stepping back and being led by things that might take us in directions we don't want to go in. And so I guess I would just love to hear from even anecdotally, what does it truly look like to remove our own self-interest from this and facilitate processes and step back but be a partner to the community. If you have any guidance or examples or hopeful words, thanks.
All right, anybody got a cheery story?
I can build on what I said earlier, if that's okay.
That's fine.
So, I love coming to this conference, okay? I love going to conferences, but this one in particular, because it always makes me think differently about my role and how I can affect change. And so this is leading to something I did last night. So I've already talked about working in the community with an advocacy group around gender and improving the lives of women and girls in that space, in that conurbation. And there are many reasons why we want to do that. One of them is because, I don't want to put a downer on this, but women and girls often don't feel safe in built-up places, and there's a real issue with regards to crime against women and girls. So we're bringing that together to provide a support network, but also be the change that we want to see happen. Our university is sort of partly involved in that people like me volunteer their time to do that. And we have 3 goals at the University of Manchester. So the University of Manchester is a Russell Group university, which means it's research intensive. It focuses on excellent research, excellent teaching, but also its 3rd goal is social responsibility. Now, being at a university that has a high-level goal of social responsibility means that we, quite rightly, should be thinking about our place in the community in which we're placed, hosted. And last night, I was on an email conversation, because remember, I'm sort of in different time zones, with a group of people at the university. And a conversation I'd had previously in the evening with Adam, who opened the session yesterday. I was talking about double invisibility. I thought that was really powerful, about being doubly invisible because of the group that you belong to. Had really inspired me to think about, okay, so what can I do to enhance what we do at the university, but not just for the benefit of the university. So I went and wrote this email to various people, and I said, it's not just what the university can do for our community, it's what our community can do for us. And I think so often we think about it just from a lens of our perspective. Oh yeah, we're this great institution and we're educating people and doing research and we're hosted in this, you know, in our case, amazing city, Manchester. And we tend to be, or maybe we is too general, maybe senior leaders often, in my experience, I find, think about what can the university do for the community that we're hosted in. But those of us who work in those communities, in the way that I've described, are trained hard to think about, yes, but the community has all this knowledge, all this wisdom, all this lived experience, all this history. What can we do collectively to work with them? So I think for me it's a reframing of the question about the space of our institutions, whoever they are, and what they can do, but getting into those spaces and having those conversations and then creating that dialogue. Data, dialogue, deeds and determination is sort of the mantra that I now live my life by. So I'm not sure if that's helpful, but I think there's something about being there and listening more than you talk, actually, I think is my takeaway.
Any thoughts, Kirsten?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think skills of dealing with ambiguity are really good. Sometimes for me the most exciting things are not knowing where things are going, and I guess in an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander context we talk all the time about the process is more important than the outcome, and so being able to be clear about your intentions and talk about, you know, co-design is such an easy word to throw around, but actually participating in that I think is yeah, a great spirited thing, but yeah, not always knowing what the destination is, but sitting with your principles and your goals, I think is really helpful.
Kathleen?
A minute and 30 seconds. It is more of a Debbie Downer, but it's in the past. So I can tell you what not to do. I found a survey in Detroit from the 70s where they said, well, we consulted with a black sociologist, and she said that this was not a good question to ask, but we asked her anyway. And this is not unusual. And I do know that within particularly within the nonprofit and the academic research world, they are doing better. Environics, they have a wonderful project where the community is designing questionnaires and focusing, and they carry that out. From our end of things, again, we can't create the research. We can only take what's been done and work with it. But we've been working with public libraries. We've been creating, which is actually more of a technological problem than anything else, the authentication and the access to the archive. But we now have a way to let public libraries be part of the Verber Center and provide access to our question bank to the general public. And I think that's really important that we think about beyond the academic world. And that some of this data, some of this information is really meaningful to individuals in their lives for a variety of reasons. So making it more available is important, time's up.
Ignore. I'm still
Red,
president.
it's all
Ignore the red sign. This has been fantastic. I do want to say thank you so much to, please help me thank our speakers. This has been a really, really informative discussion. And I will say that it is now time for a coffee break because Lord knows we all run on caffeine. And so I do want to encourage you to grab a cup of coffee, continue the conversation with the people you're sitting with our speakers, with others. There is still a lot that we can think about how to move things forward. I believe that we had a few asks, God, I hate that word, that Kathleen wants us to think about being stubborn and persistent and swallowing criticism with wine. And Jackie wants us to think about accessibility from the get-go. And I think that if I'm going to put words in your mouth, Kirsten, you would talk about community and actually having conversations that are collaborative. Is that a fair assessment? So take those three things, figure out how to do that when you get home, and then we will have lots of more discussions during the course of this week. So thank you all for being here for our opening session.